My mum's from Russia. She's from a place called Khabarovsk, which is the far east of Russia. It's about an 8-hour flight east of Moscow. It's a small place, but nevertheless, it has theatres, it has sort of all the expected cultural places that you'd want to have in a town or a city. She then went to study in Moscow, where she met my dad, who is from Eritrea, which is on the east coast of Africa, on the Red Sea. Quite a small country. It was involved with a very sort of prolonged civil war with Ethiopia for independence. I think it might have been the longest civil war within Africa. It's about 30 years. But things have sort of cleared up now, and there's no war recently. The two countries have sort of made peace, and things are going quite well in that aspect. At the time when they met, my dad wasn't allowed to stay past his studies in the Soviet Union, and obviously my mum and they were married, and they had my older sister. At the time she was born in Moscow, so they had to go somewhere. So he couldn't stay there. They couldn't go back to Eritrea because there was a war going on. So they came to the UK. They were lucky enough to have refuge in the UK, and they came in the early 80s, I think it was. And they settled down. They made their life in the UK, and then I came along in 86. And yeah. Growing up, it was a very sort of multicultural atmosphere. My dad speaks Russian because he's learnt at university. So I grew up talking Russian. My dad was, I say, lazy, or I don't know, but he never taught me Tigrinya, which is the native language of Eritrea. But I always was involved culturally with Eritrean weddings, christenings, festivals, or you name it, that sort of thing. So it was very part of my day-to-day life, as was the Russian side of things. And then obviously when I started going to school, I learned English. Obviously learned English at home as well, but that's another aspect of, like, you go to school, you have friends, all that sort of stuff. So in my head, my sort of cultural background is this sort of three-way between the UK, Russia and Eritrea. So I'm glad for it. It's very, very, very rich in all the aspects that you can think of, and musically as well. It's shaped my music, I think, through all the things that I've spoken about in terms of the music that I grew up with and the cultural music from Russia and Eritrea that have influenced my music along the way. My very first encounter with music was probably at primary school, where I started playing the recorder, as I think the majority of young school kids might have the opportunity to do at schools. So that was my way into music. It was fun. I had a very sort of enthusiastic music teacher at the time. And then after that, I went on to study the violin, which was probably because of my parents. They sort of had the idea that they would introduce me to music. My mum's quite musical, she plays the piano. So I started playing the violin. It was a hobby. After that I took up the piano, and after that I took up composition. So I started going to Saturday music schools. Centre for Young Musician in Tooting was my first sort of school that I went to and studied. We did musicianship, had choirs, we had one-to-one lessons, violin. It was a great place. After that, I progressed to the Royal College of Music Junior Department, where I took up composition and was the first place where I sort of studied it properly. Again, a great department where we had the opportunity to work with dancers, to write for dance music, work with choreographers, even at that sort of early stage. And I think it was at that point where my interest in composing really took off. And during the time I was there, I decided to switch from third study composition to first study composition. So eventually when I went on to university, where I went to Royal Northern College of Music, I was a composer, and then a musician was my sort of secondary aspect. I also studied in St. Petersburg for a while, and whilst I was out there, it was more sort of the violin sort of side of things, but I did also study composition with a guy called Sergei Slonimsky, who is very, how shall I say, his music is of the Russian tradition in the sense that it was quite Shostakovich-y, Prokofiev-like. Russia's a great place for the formal training of musicians, but in the sense of sort of exploring your creativity, it's a little bit blinkered, but each place has its own benefits, which is great. So when I went to study at the Northern, I studied with Gary Carpenter and then with David Horn. A great place, lots of opportunities for composers. I'm quite happy that I went there because I think if I'd stayed in London, I wouldn't have explored so much the sort of opportunities that could come up, because I think it's sometimes good to get out of your comfort zone and go to different places. So at the Northern, they always have different compositional festivals. They invite composers from around the world. They also collaborate with different institutions in the area, such as the Halle, the BBC Phil, Royal Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra, which is great because you're part of that medley and you get to really mingle and mix and make connections, and work with different orchestras and chamber groups and soloists and stuff. So it was a great place to sort of build up a portfolio of works that you could then take on to other places or use to promote your own music. So yeah, it's for me it was a very important stage of my career to move forward and to where I am now.
I'm interested in the sort of the Russian influence.
Mm-hmm.
In what way did that sort of contribute to your development as an artist? You said it was sort of technical.
Yeah, I think for me, Russian music, I'm always intrigued by the line. So I sort of generalize and say my Russian influence is the line in my music, and my African influence is probably more the rhythm and the, how shall I say, the more punchy elements of, I don't necessarily like a clean orchestral sound. I like it to be quite noisy and quite grimy. And for me, it's that sort of idea. I think the linear is also to do with the sort of driving force going forward in a piece, could be also attributed to Russian music. But at the same time, the rhythm, you know, it depends how you write the piece, how it goes forward. And I think it's also my my lessons learnt from studying in the Russian school as a violinist, the sort of discipline that's needed, the sort of not turning back, always going forwards. Lots of practice. It's always been, it's stood me in good ground in a compositional sense, because I think composing is harder than playing, because A, you're creating from scratch, which is rewarding but also very difficult, and B, the life of a composer is also not the easiest one to choose. So at least with if you're a musician, you can sort of play in an orchestra, or you can create a chamber group. As a composer, you can't sort of, unless you're a composer in residence somewhere, which is great, but there's no sort of job per se that you can go and find and do. You have to sort of create your own career, whether it's a portfolio career, whatever, but it's very sort of hands-on, very diverse, and tough at times. So yeah, you have to keep it real.
When did you become interested in music making seriously?
I think it was closer to the time where my violin and piano studies were getting to a point where I started dabbling around with what I was doing on the instruments. So I might be playing a piece at the time, and I thought, oh, what if I try and, you know, as you do at that age, you sort of mimic what you're playing or what you're hearing. And those were my first endeavours into the world of composition. I remember writing some piano pieces, and then a string quartet, and then a piece for violin and piano. So it was very much using the instruments that I was comfortable with and that I was playing myself. And yeah, even from that age, so the string quartet that I wrote was called Rashaida, which is one of the ethnic tribes in Eritrea. And I think it was after a trip I had to Eritrea where they have an expo every summer. And at this expo they have the different tribes from the different regions of Eritrea come in, and each tribe has a platform to do their performance and do their thing. I was intrigued by the sort of sounds and the different rhythms that were going on, and I obviously must have taken the influence from there for this piece, which was named after the tribe. And then on the other spectrum, I remember when I wrote a piece for violin and piano, and it was very much like a sort of Kabalevsky, Shostakovich type piece, because I must have been, I think, playing some sort of Shostakovich, Kabalevsky influence type piece at the time. So yeah, and then obviously as you move on from those immediate influences, you begin to sort of either blend or see how you can take things in different ways and start to mix things about. So yeah, those were my first sort of endeavours as a young composer.
In your experience, how often do performers give a sort of faithful interpretation of what you imagined?
On the whole, I would say it's pretty good. I think the more you work with musicians, and this goes back to the idea of also working with soloists and performance in a sort of chamber music sense, you sort of learn how people will react to certain things in terms of how you've written things, or how things will sound. So in that sense, you learn to preempt things. You know, if there's a certain passage and you want them to play a certain way in the next sort of couple of bars, then you can, there are ways of there are tricks of the trade to sort of preempt it and try and put it into the music to make it more easier and apparent for the performer to go down the route that you want them to go down. And again, I think that that comes down to language, the idea of communication. For me, it's important to be, I think it's quite important to be as clear as possible when you're writing your music, because at the end of the day, your music could go anywhere. It could go to a different country, to people who have a lot of experience playing new music or might not have that much experience. So it's important for the situations where I'm not present for the music to speak for itself, and for it to be interpreted in a genuine and authentic way. So yeah, I think in fact in that sort of practical aspect definitely came from Gary Carpenter. He was always very sort of down to earth with the way he wrote his music. But that doesn't mean to say that the music itself was not interesting or intriguing or complex in its own nature. It was just on paper, it's very approachable, which I think is important.
When do you know a piece is finished?
That's a good question. You know a piece is finished when the deadline comes. Or no, I mean, on a practical level, usually the commissions that I get, there is a set time limit, and I know what I'm working towards. So I've never come across an experience where I've had to just keep on writing, or that I don't know where the end point is. I can imagine it being quite tricky. It might be quite liberating to write like that. I don't know, but I've always had the time limit handed to me. So whether that sort of boxes me in a bit, I don't know. I find it quite good because it gives me parameters to work in. So yeah.
Is it important to you what audiences think about your music, and how much or often does this factor into your composing activities? Is it important to you that they like your music?
Yeah, I'm going to say yes, because at the end of the day, your music is there to be listened to, or mine is anyway. I mean, some people write for themselves and aren't really bothered about the performative or audience aspect, but for me it is important because it's concert music. Who goes to concerts? Audiences. So it sort of goes against it if I say no. And yeah, I mean, obviously feedback and opinion is important, but at the same time you sometimes have to take it with a pinch of salt. If you know, some people might like it, some people might not like it. Art is subjective, so there's always going to be people who like it more than others. So I think it's important to go away from concerts, or even if you have a recording and you know people review and people leave comments, and you know, I've had these conversations with many a musician or composer as to, you know, people possibly not understanding or wanting to understand where you're coming from. As I said before as well, audiences can be conservative sometimes. So whether you want to approach that knowing if you have a premiere somewhere and you know that the audience will be maybe not so open to new music, do you want to address that in the piece? That's a decision for the composer to make. But I think at the end of the day, you have to be true to yourself. You're the creator. You're the one spending time making the music. So, not to say that you're only exclusively writing for your own aesthetic, but you would hope that the aesthetic you're creating can be appreciated. And I suppose that's more of a global question as well. When you are creating or when you are writing, are you aiming your music for what is your audience? Is it other musicians or composers? Is it the general public? Is it something that you don't even care if people listen to, and you sort of do it for yourself? Those are questions that are always on, I think, musicians and composers' minds.